Hi guys, good morning and welcome to today's panel, How to Fix the Fix, Understanding the Links Between Sports Betting Integrity and Problem Gambling. My name is Mark Potter, former professional rugby player and now head of delivery at US at Epic Risk Management. I'm delighted to be hosting today. To help me discuss this topic, I'm joined by a fantastic panel from various backgrounds that will help us provide some more insight into this interesting and I guess very relevant topic. We have Michelle Evans, Head of Communications at Wellbeing for PFA Scotland, Scott Davis, Epic Risk Management Lead Pro Sports Facilitator and Recovered Problem Gambler, and then Lee Calverley, Sports Integrity Lead at GVC Holdings. If I just come to each of you guys to give us just a brief introduction to yourselves and your background. If we start with you, Scott.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Scott Davis, former professional footballer, recovering gambling addict as well. I'm now professional sports facilitator for Epic Risk Management. So my job is that I use my lived experience in gambling-related harm, travelling around not only the country but Europe as well, from some of the programmes that we've run, hoping that I can tell my story, show some weaknesses and some vulnerability in order for people to come forward and get necessary help if that's required.
Great stuff. Cheers, Scott. Michelle?
Hi, as Mark says, Michelle Evans from PFA Scotland, Head of Communication and Wellbeing. More so for this chat, it's about the wellbeing aspect of my job. Basically, we look after the welfare of our 1,300 members, professional players in Scotland, looking after them from all kinds of things, from mental health issues all the way through to problem, which the fact that I'm on this today is because, as we know, there is a problem with gambling in football. So yeah, we deal with players if they need help. We can signpost them. We have our own people that we can use, or people further afield. We also do education and awareness. We go around and speak to the players to try and make them aware of the issues.
Brilliant, thank you. Lee, finally, let's go to you.
Hi everyone, so I'm Lee Calverley, Sports Integrity Lead at GVC. I've been working in this area for about 8 years, so primarily working with regulators, sports governing bodies and other third parties across the world to deal with integrity issues, so that can be match fixing or sports rule breaches. So quite extensive experience working on investigations with sports, which has involved writing numerous statements on match fixing cases and also giving evidence at sports governing body hearings.
Great stuff. So we've got a really diverse and great panel that we're going to hopefully shed some more light into this topic for you today. Look, over the last 12 months, there's been a number of high-profile cases of sports betting integrity breaches. Even earlier this month, England star Kieran Trippier was charged with misconduct over a breach of FA betting rules. We've also in the recent past seen Wales rugby coach Rob Howley suspended on the eve of the Rugby Union World Cup in Japan, and Pakistan international cricketer batsman Nasir Jamshed jailed for his part in a spot fixing scandal. And indeed, in the case of Rob Howley, and since his charge and subsequent dismissal from the Wales coaching staff, he has come out and publicly discussed his issues with problem gambling. And I think this probably begs the question, do we need to better understand the links between sports betting integrity issues and those problem gambling in more detail? And I guess historically, sports betting integrity and problem gambling have been treated and seen as separate issues with different processes of education, treatment and regulation. I think throughout our work at Epic Risk Management, as Scott alluded to earlier, and in particular within our gambling harm minimisation programmes delivered across Europe and the world, I think we believe and we've started to see a strong link between the two. So the question today is should they be treated as combined threats to sport in the future? And I think if we can start with you, Scott, could you just give us a brief illustration of your own experiences of suffering from a problem gambling addiction while attempting to carve out a successful career in professional football? And then also, do you think by being a professional athlete has made you more susceptible to gambling harm?
Yeah, it was really difficult. I think from a young age where you have time, money, opportunity, it's hard to find a fix outside of football for what you want to focus on. And for me, it turned out to be gambling. It was something that started out as a little bit of fun, turned into a problem, and then in the latter days turned into an addiction. And I'm ashamed to say it, but at the same time, I'm not, where I did breach integrity. I always put it down to the fact that I couldn't stop for myself. I couldn't stop for my family. I couldn't stop for absolutely anyone. So to try and play by the rules, to try and stick to morals and principles, rules and regulations was really, really tough. I knew that I was doing wrong, but my addiction had the better of me. And in the end, I sort of came clean to my parents and I told them that I couldn't no longer go on with this problem that I had. And it was tough. I think that being a competitive sports person at the time, it sort of enabled me to be competitive in the gambling world as well. So when I did place bets, I wanted to make sure that I won pretty much every bet, but that's not possible. So when I did lose bets, I made sure that the next thing that I did was place another one. And little did I know it would be a vicious circle that would go on for 10.5 years, cost me sort of £250,000 in finance, about £50,000-60,000 my parents' money, and it would ruin my mental health alongside that as well. So it was something that sort of took my career out of my own hands. Ever since I was a little boy, I dreamt of playing football, and I was luckily enough, fortunate enough to be able to do that for a long period of time. But for me, I look back, and if I'd have taken my addiction out of the game, would I have done better? I'd like to have thought so. But it's something that at the age of 27, it was too late to go back into. Once I'd combat the addiction, I'd gone to rehab and come out the other side. And I think it's so important now that I can show where I was at in my life in order to help other people. So in terms of the aspect of when you're not playing in a football match, or if you're not playing in a rugby match, you're on the bench and you're not getting the opportunity to go and show what you can do and what you're all about. I think gambling gave me that. The euphoria of scoring a goal was very similar to putting a bet on a horse or spinning a roulette machine. And it gave me that fixation, that buzz, that stimulation that I craved, as I'm sure you did as well. So I didn't ever think that I'd start out gambling for it to be anything other than a little bit of a hobby, a little bit of fun. But little did I know it took over my life and completely crippled my career.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can really relate to that. As you know, I played professional sports also and was also a pathological gambler. And I think for me, it was, I guess, being a sportsman brought its own stresses and pressures. Naturally competitive people who hated to lose. And I think once I started to gamble, I think that played a massive part in it, because I always wanted to get back to zero when I was in debt, because I didn't want to be seen as a loser. I think similar or slightly different to you, I guess, my issues came about due to an injury. And for what I wasn't getting from what I needed as a professional athlete, as the ups and downs and adrenaline of winning and losing, and sort of the adrenaline buzz of playing and missing the banter with all the boys, I really found that in gambling. And the ups and downs of winning and losing on horses were really, really similar. And I can absolutely relate to that. Just as a follow-up, do you think at the height of your addiction, and you've sort of already alluded to this, you were more at risk of betting integrity breaches because of your ongoing problems?
Yeah, definitely. I think that you just obviously alluded to the fact that you had a big win at a young age and that set you off on your gambling career. I had a really interesting chat with a footballer last week where he said to me that he was rewarded with a signing on fee and a new contract. And for him, that enabled him to go and gamble more money, bigger amounts. So in the footballing world, with signing on fees and a new contract, it's very similar to that of a big win, where all of a sudden you've got money that you've not had before. And I had that at 19 years old, where I'd gone over £100,000 a year. No one had ever taught me how to spend my money, how to look after my money. So for me, I was free to do what I wanted. In terms of the betting breaches, of course, I completely understand that people need to be obviously disciplined. There need to be rules and regulations. And I think there's three ways. I think people either don't breach the rules. People breach the rules with ignorance, thinking they can get away with it. And on the third hand, there's people that breach the rules that probably can't play by the rules because of their addiction. It's not something where I do believe that everyone is trying to beat the system because they're being ignorant. There will be people out there similar to myself that just couldn't stop themselves from doing that. I'm not proud of the person that I was back in the day. There's a lot of things that I wish I could have changed, but I couldn't see myself stopping for myself and my family the most important things in my life at the time. So to try and stop for the FA, to try and stop for the governing bodies was really, really difficult. And unless you have an addiction, if you've been through that addiction, it's probably quite hard to fathom, quite hard to understand. But it is true, and I'm sure that you would speak similar to what I have about that as well.
Yeah, I think I absolutely relate to that. And I guess, like us both, I guess we were both brought up by really great parents, morally right, and always thought you would go on to do the right things. And I think I've always suggested this at the absolute height of my addiction. If somebody would have come to me and offered me money to fix a certain event or ask the team news or whatever it was that would have breached integrity issues, I'm pretty sure that I would have done it, based on the fact that I was so desperate for money, so desperate to get out of debt, and so desperate to sort of hide what I was doing. And I think that the moral compass had disappeared so much that it would have been a real issue. And I think people look at betting integrity and automatically think match fixing. But I think when we come to Lee in a little while, he'll be able to put some more context around how there are very much more at play than just that. But absolutely, Scott, I can totally relate to what you went through and how those betting on sports can be so easy to do, because again, it was just something that growing up and sort of dreaming about a career that you love became essentially a chore at one point for me, and it was something that if somebody would have offered me the money, as I say, I'm pretty sure I would have done it. I think we can come to you now, Michelle. Look, it's no secret that there's recently been an integrity issue within Scottish football. Can you give us a brief overview of what happened and maybe tell us how that has impacted, I guess, your organisation and Scottish football in general?
Yeah, I won't mention the player's name or anything like that. It is in the public domain, but I'm not comfortable mentioning his name. But yeah, a player in League Two who, as most players in League Two and below leagues think, nobody would know who they are. Nobody would ever think for a minute if they were betting on football they would get caught. He and his friends did a bit of spot fixing in a game that they were playing in one of the cups up here. He was to take a booking at a certain time in the game. That's happened obviously behind the scenes. As you'll know, the bookies have an obligation to look into this stuff when they see a spike in the background, and then they have an obligation to report it to the governing body if it involves football. So it was investigated over probably about a period of 6 months, I think. And then around a year ago, I'm losing time with all this COVID stuff, hasn't been locked up for so long, but around a year ago, he got a knock on the, well, not even a knock on the door, his front door was bashed in by the police. 5 o'clock in the morning, him and his friend's houses were raided, and they had the money, unfortunately, in loads of cash in the flat. They were arrested, all of their phones, their computers, everything were taken away. There was a huge investigation and they were eventually charged with it. And the case is about to go live this month. The first diet is going to happen. The player, there's a good likelihood, as we've explained to him, that he could end up in jail. You know, if he's found guilty, he could end up in jail, wreck not just his football career, but, you know, his life as well. The governing body up here are obviously desperate to get their teeth into it and, you know, punish him in some way, but, you know, they can't do anything until the actual investigation, the whole trial is finished. But we've got a very, very nervous player at the moment, you know, wondering what is going to happen to him going forward. And, you know, it is in the public domain up here, so we use that to try and educate the other players. You know, when we were able to go out and talk to them about, you know, the problems that are out there, you know, the threats that are out there. I mean, interestingly, when his manager first called me about it was actually the manager that called me rather than the player in the first instance, because he was at that point in the police cells. But the manager said he didn't even need anybody to tell him what the accusation was, what the charge was. He knew right away the exact game, the exact challenge that had happened, and everybody in the team, when they look back, said, we were wondering what was he up to? What was he doing? You know, so, you know, there was somebody that we don't know if it was if there was a problem gambling in the background. We don't know that yet. We don't know if somebody, him or one of his friends are in trouble and they needed the money. We don't know if it was just a one-off daft lads together wanting to, you know, thinking a way they can make some money. So we're waiting to find out once the case starts.
I guess it doesn't just that kind of thing doesn't just impact the person or the player in question. I can only imagine that has had a really negative impact on the club supporters, lack of playing time, the league, you guys. Can you just give us a bit of an insight into sort of, I can only imagine the negative impact that has had in Scottish football?
Absolutely. You know, we've always kind of, I think, you know, we work closely with FIFPro, the World Players Union, and across Europe, as I'm sure you're more than aware, especially Eastern Europe, there's been a lot of issues over the years with match fixing. There was quite a very prominent one in Malta recently with a young player that was approached to do, you know, for match fixing, and he ended up in jail. We've not had a major issue here, but we know you'd be silly to think that it's not going to crop up at some point. So this, I mean, this lad, he lived in a small town up north. He's had to leave his hometown because he was walking down the street and people were, you know, whispering about him. His club, to be fair to his club, I'll give his club their due, they stood by him. They actually gave him a new contract and they've given him, they're helping him out with the legal support. But, you know, it does impact Scottish football because people start to look at it. You know, the governing bodies start to look at players, look into, you know, player behaviour more. The police start to look in, and off the back of what happened with him, there's been 2 more stories have broken about 2 other players who are being investigated for possible integrity. So, you know, it's kind of opens a can of worms, and it makes our job even more difficult. You know, we're going out, we're trying to educate them, we're making them aware of all this stuff, and we're talking to them. But you know, sometimes you do feel like you're hitting your head against a brick wall. You know, it's horrible when you get issues like these lads, and you want to help them, want to do everything we can to help them, but at the end of the day, it's difficult. They have to listen. I mean, you know, I've spoken to you about some cases that I've had to deal with, not necessarily integrity ones, but you know, we're having more and more players up here being caught betting on football, despite the fact that we go out and we tell them, I don't know how many times we tell them, you can't bet on football. Doesn't matter where in the world it is, doesn't matter, you can't do it. There's more and more players getting caught, but worryingly, there's more and more players, and it seems to be getting worse as we go on with a problem gambling. You know, and you get to that point, and you know, I was interested in what Scott was talking about, the 3 different reasons, and the third one being you can't stop. And there's more and more players that are coming forward now, and I'm dealing with, and they have an addiction that they can't stop. And you know, it's up to us as an organisation when they're in front of the governing body on one of the disciplinary hearings to try and make them understand they have an addiction, they can't help themselves. They have a sickness, they have a cancer. If they were sitting there, their hair falling out, you know, looking absolutely awful because they actually had cancer, you'd be feeling sorry for them. But this boy has the same kind of problem. He has a sickness. So it's become a huge part of my job, worryingly, in the last kind of year or so.
So it sounds like it's only growing, and I'm sure myself and Scott would only back you up in saying that it's something that I guess it only highlights the topic of this panel, is the links between the two seem to be growing stronger and stronger because there's more integrity breaches coming out of the woodwork sort of as we go along. And as you say, you're dealing with more and more problem gamblers as such. I think, look, and I know you work really hard and you do a lot of work, but you've got to cover a lot of clubs and a lot of players. Do you think enough is being done, or is there more help you would like to receive around these key topics?
I think, I mean, I always do with anything, whether it's gambling addiction, whether it's mental health, you can never do enough. You know, there's always, you have to keep going out there, you have to keep pressing the message. I'm sure when the players see me coming, they go, oh God, here she is again, you know, telling us, don't bet in football, don't do this. I feel like I'm a teacher and I'm telling them, you're a bad boy, don't do that, don't do that. And, you know, it does get to that point where, but then if anything happens, you're the first person they'll pick up the phone to. You know, and I mean, listening, I know your story, we've spoken before. I know a wee bit about Scott's story through PPF because we work with PPF. But, you know, the kind of, I think the lived experience and the awareness of actually seeing a sports person, somebody who's walked in your shoes in front of you, I can't stress enough how important I personally think that is, in trying to make them aware. Because if they sit in a room, Mark, you came up, I helped you come up to Hibs up here, you know, a couple of years ago, and spoke to some of the young lads. And, you know, there's been issues with a couple of those lads going forward, but your talk that day triggered something in them that made them think, you know, oh, wait a minute, that's me. So I just think that having more people coming forward and actually wanting to tell their story, who have been there, that is the only way that we can try and raise awareness, you know, amongst them, educate them.
And I think that's essentially what we try and do with our programs within Sport Epic. Look, the idea of them are not to catch people out who are in the midst of an addiction or in the midst of betting integrity issues. The idea is to prevent that from happening, and hopefully by talking through our sort of experiences, helps people to explore their own relationship with both, I guess. And I think that's been really useful in I would guess mitigating plenty of guys from getting to that stage where they're actually committing crimes, as one of your guys has done, and hopefully stopping themselves or allowing them to understand their experiences and their sort of relationship with gambling before it gets to that point. I think, and it's a really good point. I think we can sort of come to Lee, because I guess you will probably come at this from a different angle, Lee, as the integrity lead for GVC. Can you give us an idea of the level of risk that this causes to both sports and the operators, and what are the most at-risk sports in terms of numbers of breaches?
Yeah, sure. So I think for sports and operators, that the main issue is the confidence in the product. So just briefly touching on sports, and obviously from an operator, sports rely on fans, on commercial sponsorships. If there's an issue with the integrity of the sport, then that's going to impact sports revenues. And from an operator's point of view, we offer betting markets that our customers demand are fair and transparent. So when we're offering betting markets that there are issues with, ultimately that can affect the future confidence of our product. So it's important as an operator that we've got robust processes in place to identify issues, integrity issues, and report those to the relevant parties who can assist.
Yeah, I mean, I guess these sports partnerships are really fruitful for all parties. I also think that there's probably a duty of care that sits at the back of that to help educate these players, to help players better understand what it means, because I'm sure you'd sort of agree, Scott, is we've gone out and talked to guys before and they didn't really have the best understanding of what betting integrity was. I said, so if you can just give us an idea of, because as I said before, people just automatically think betting integrity, match fixing. Can you just give us an idea of what betting integrity as a whole involves, Lee, and how people can misconstrue what that actually means?
Sure. So I tend to think of betting integrity in two different strands. So the first one would be the match fixing and the spot fixing element. So very briefly, match fixing is impacting the final result of an event. Spot fixing is corrupting a smaller element that may not impact the final result. So Michelle's example of a player getting a yellow card is a good example of spot fixing. That team didn't necessarily go on to lose that match. So it just impacted a much smaller element of that match. So those types of issues come to our attention through our own risk monitoring. So we've got a number of our trading team who will be live monitoring markets and can pick up unusual activity. So that can be unusual volumes, unusual price movements in markets. We obviously risk assess the products that we offer. So in terms of the largest betting sports, they would be football, tennis. We do see the odd issues in snooker and darts, but the two biggest sports that we would see issues with are football and tennis, but they are the two biggest betting sports. So that correlation is obvious, I suppose. And then the second element to the integrity issue is the rule breaches. So each sports governing body and each jurisdiction has different rules that participants are covered by. So English and Scottish footballers, for example, are not allowed to bet on football anywhere in the world. Tennis players can't bet on professional tennis players can't bet on tennis. The same with cricket. Now, it does get slightly complicated in other jurisdictions where the football rules can be something like players aren't allowed to bet on leagues or competitions that they've played in during that season. So if a French footballer's bet on the French domestic cup final and they've played in that competition earlier in the season but been knocked out, that is a breach. Or if they've not played in the French second division, they would be allowed to bet on that. So just as an example, it can be quite complicated. Now, as an operator, where we become aware of a participant, ideally before any rule breaches have taken place, then we can put blocks on an account to stop them doing that, depending on the different rules. Now, as I say, that can get very nuanced and complicated. Now, again, when we identify rule breaches, as Michelle touched on, we then have a duty to report that to the sports governing body and our different regulators around the world. So we would work with a lot of UK domestic sports governing bodies, and obviously the UK Gambling Commission, but also regulators and other sports governing bodies globally.
Yeah, and look, that's really interesting. And I think people generally would see just match fixing, but there's things as much as sharing team information, team news, and I know that happened in rugby union where a pair of brothers met for a coffee the night before and they talked about moves that they were going to do, and as a general conversation, and that player was then, somebody overheard the conversation, and that player has literally never played a game of rugby since, because that was seen as an integrity breach. I think if you could just give us a brief description, Lee, for the audience of how an integrity breach is initially flagged, and then what the process is that takes place once that occurs.
Yeah, so I'll use the match fixing example. So we offer thousands of betting markets per day, and over the course of a year, that's obviously a huge number. Now, it is a small number of markets that we actually see integrity issues with, but we do have a large trading team whose job it is to live monitor markets. So primarily the job of the guys in the trading team is to manage the commercial risk from our point of view. So any markets where there's unusual activity, so that could be customers targeting a specific event, that then flags up for analysis. So obviously we've got experts who cover different sports. They can look at the betting activity and make an assessment of whether that is justified based on it being a large price. Is it betting related? Is it a good bet, or is there something more? Is it a match fixing issue or potentially a match fixing issue? So that assessment will be done internally. Now that goes through almost a chain of command at our company, and I'm sure most betting operators are the same. Once that almost comes to the final stage internally, and we've got that issue, we are confident that this is a potential case of suspicious betting activity. That's when it depends which particular sport it's on and in which jurisdiction. But if we use the UK example, we would then have a duty to report that to the UK Gambling Commission and to the particular UK sport for their investigation. So at the first stage, that could just be an email with the details of the alert, which event that we think's been corrupted potentially, and then at some point, if the sports governing body do their own assessment and agree with that, then we can share account level information. So that would be who is the punter, their personal details, how much have they bet, how much have they won, how does that tie in with other customers who've bet on the market. We can also provide things like almost typically on this type of market, we would see on average X amount of money. On this market, we saw 20 times that amount from 5 customers who all live in the same town, who are friends with Xplayer on Facebook. So what I would say is it's a staged process almost in line with data protection, but we alert the sports governing body as soon as we can, and then following that, we're available to provide further information as and when assisting with the case and the investigation.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because I guess for the wider audience that they've never been involved in professional sport, they might not understand the sheer amount of risk that there is around integrity now, and I guess if you guys have alluded to, especially you, Michelle, there's more and more that are coming out into the public domain, and actually we've got to find a way of preventing that. I guess the next question for you all is, in my opinion, it's clear to see that problem gambling is an issue within professional sport. Both myself and Scott have been prime exhibits of that. I think, do you guys, Lee and Michelle, think that by problem gambling increases the risk of sports betting integrity breaches? And have you seen any of those in terms of both? Lee, let's go with you first with that one.
Sure. So I think on the rule breaches side, I think I certainly wouldn't be an expert in terms of studies that have been done into this, but I think that the correlation between a participant having a gambling problem and placing bets on events that they shouldn't bet on, that seems very logical, and there's a heightened risk for those participants doing that. What I don't think has ever been studied is does a participant with a problem gambling issue, does that make them more likely to engage in match fixing and spot fixing? So I've dealt with a number of cases across a number of different sports. I personally haven't seen that correlation on the match fixing and the spot fixing side. I would say that the driver mainly for players to commit, match fixing offences would be more around lower wages and uncertain futures in terms of contracts, particularly as the current period we're in. Our club short of money, does that mean players are more likely to be targeted? I would think, just from my experience, that is more likely to drive the match fixing and the spot fixing angle. But like I say, it's not an area that's really been covered. I suppose because there are so few convictions for match fixing, it's very difficult to have a wide-ranging study of what particular issues cause participants to match fix or spot fix.
Yeah. And if we could just sort of come to you now, I guess both Michelle and Scott, given the roles that you do and the fact that you see many players each year, in the last could you give us a ballpark figure of, in Scottish football, let's start with you, Michelle, is the number of people that have come forward with issues around gambling? Is it growing, and what sort of figures are we talking now?
I think I'm always quick to point out, we're obviously talking about sport here, but I mean, gambling is a societal problem. It's not just, it isn't just sport, it's not just football, and I'm very quick to point that out whenever anybody, does get caught doing it. I do think, I can't give you a figure because a lot of it doesn't necessarily go through us. It just goes straight to the kind of counselling service we have. But yeah, I have noticed in terms of the cases where players are caught breaching the rules, there has been a rise in them. There's definitely been a rise in them, and they're certainly more willing to come forward to us to ask for help with it. But again, I'm finding that the majority of it, the ones that I've dealt with far too many in the last year, they've all been problem gamblers. It's all been about problem gambling and the fact that they've not been able to stop. You were talking about the kind of match integrity stuff there as well. What you were talking about, I think the link between it all is about desperation. And if you said that at the height of your gambling, if somebody came to you and asked you to do it, you were too desperate for money, you'd have done it. You wouldn't necessarily, you're not doing it, you're not thinking it's a criminal act when you're doing it, but you've also got to think about the guys that get into the debt because of their gambling, and they turn to the wrong kind of people to help dig them out, and then they get caught up in that vicious web of criminality and with their own people, and that focuses them down a road that they just can't stop going down. But yeah, I mean, I haven't necessarily come across that in Scottish football per se, but there's definitely been an increase in problem gambling cases when they're caught for rule breaching.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that desperation is a really good point and a really good word, because I guess nobody grows up, I guess nobody starts gambling to become a problem gambler. And I guess nobody starts to play professional sport to commit integrity breaches. But I think you're right, that as soon as desperation kicks in, and I'm sure you can sort of highlight that now, Scott, is that massively increases the risks. And I think that's where the correlation lies between the two. Have you seen an increase in people coming forward and reaching out to you, Scott, for both over the last sort of couple of years?
Yeah, I've obviously been really fortunate to run the EFL program that we do, and I've seen a number of players. I think we've had contact post-session with around 150 players. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've got a gambling problem, but they were ringing up about their relationship with gambling to maybe get some answers from me in terms of what their relationship does look like. So I could give them, not professional advice, I don't call it, but I can give them my lived experience advice on what they might want to put in place, whether it's tools and things like that to sort of stem the flow of gambling. We obviously saw the other day the PFA released figures around the stats during lockdown of players that have reached out, and gambling now is by far the biggest addiction that they have to deal with. So it just shows the problem is only on the increase. That won't be news to people. I think that's fully expected. I think these days, having been a professional footballer, you can walk into the changing room in the morning. If you stink of alcohol, you'll be frowned upon. If you take drugs, you get urine tested and blood tested in the morning. So that's not doable. So a lot of people do turn to gambling. It is their go-to. It is their release. And I think now, more than ever, more needs to be done in world football, in world sport, to be able to help these players, because it's only going to get worse for players. I do believe that unless we run more sort of educational programs, use lived experience, and help guide people in a better way. Because I was 27 when I stopped gambling. Not once did anyone ever talk to me in football about problem gambling, how it can become an issue, until these programs started a few years ago. So I kind of missed the boat a little bit. And I look back with a little bit of frustration, and I think to myself, well, if I'd have heard what I needed to hear at 21 years old, would I have got into problem gambling? Would I have breached integrity? I hope to think that I wouldn't have. So I just think it's so important that we can spread as many positive messages as possible in order to help as many people as we can.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And like you rightly point out, is sport is so professionalised now that drugs and alcohol are really something that are falling away, kind of, because guys are so professional in what they do and look after themselves so well that actually gambling, that naturally increases the propensity to gamble, because it's one of the only things you can do legally, I guess, as a sportsman, albeit not on your own sport. And I think that massively plays a part in that. And I will never forget turning up to training one day, and I'd literally been up till 6 or 7 in the morning. I'd had about an hour and a half sleep. I lost about 10 grand in the evening. I was in no condition to train whatsoever, and my mind was everywhere. And one of the other guys walked in, and he'd had an argument with his wife the night before, and he'd ended up going out and having about 8 pints in the pub to sort of take his mind away from it. Walked past the coach, he smelt of booze, and he got fined 2 weeks' wages. And I just walked past him, and like nothing was ever said. And I just thought that can't be right. So I think what we've discussed is really important, and I think problem gambling is only getting bigger and more prevalent. The links between integrity are getting bigger and I guess more prevalent. We've talked about certain things that are happening at the moment. We've talked about the risks and the increased sort of ways that you can breach a sporting event. I think if I can just finish the last couple of minutes, just come to each of you. If there was one thing that we could do to help mitigate these risks and create a joined up approach on it, what is the one thing you would like to see that you think could help with this? For me, it would be, I think you're rightly, a prevalent study would be unbelievable from either problem gamblers or people that have breached integrity issues to see whether there was a correlation. But what is the one thing that you would like to see more of to help prevent this going forward? I think we'll start with you, Lee, let's say.
Yeah, so I think I would like to see a more joined up approach around education. So obviously we've worked with you guys at Epic on education programs. We've worked with a small number of sports governing bodies where we've assisted with their education. But I suppose as an operator, what some of the things that I've talked about today, that's something that we can do for sports and their participants, potentially, you know, in the form of, like you say, there's a lot of participants that need educating. Can that be done in, you know, a short video from the operator side, just to give a summary of the issues?
Yeah, look, our time's coming to an end now. I think we've got a minute left, but I guess for both you, Michelle and Scott, I would imagine education joined up approach sounds about right, does it?
Absolutely, that's the most important thing in getting the message out there. Quickly, I would like to say, I think that the hidden, the secret nature of gambling addiction, that's very stigmatized. I would say more so than mental health now. I think more people talk about mental health. I think we need more people to talk out like you guys have and share their experiences and their stories to let people know that they're not alone and that they can get help.
Yeah. Final point from you, Scott.
Yeah, I think it's taken away the stigma. I think it's taken away all the worry from those professional players in world sport, and showing them that they're not the only people that may be struggling. I hope that I would have come forward if I was stood in front of me a few years back when I was gambling. And I think education is the most important thing, because together we can make a difference in doing that, and hopefully save more players' careers.
Yeah, and I think that's a joined up approach between educators, operators, leagues and everyone. And look, finally, I just want to thank you all for coming and joining us, especially you guys on the panelists. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Hopefully it's put some more context around why we think this is a growing issue. And hope those of you that have joined remotely have found it interesting and useful. If anybody has any questions, please reach out to us via LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever that may be, and by all means ask away. But thank you again to the guys for joining and putting some really good insight into this conversation. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers. See you soon.